Hi everyone, welcome to Elvis Presley Past, Present and Future, where we will continue on our Elvis journey. In the last video, we left off where Vernon had just come out of jail and he was living again with his family. So let's continue the journey. Finally, the little family was united again. The ordeal of his incarceration seemed to thicken the bonds tying the family together. Vernon first got a job helping build public outhouses in early May 1939. Vernon was enrolled as a WPA Work Progress Administration worker and assigned to the sanitation project in Lee County. He would work 140 hours each month for $30.10. By July he was upgraded in skill to carpenter and cement finisher, and his pay was raised to $52 a month. In those terrible hard times, when the cost of food, housing and clothing was minimal, this was high security indeed, and the Presleys needed all the security they could get. Vernon also needed to show the authorities that he deserved the suspension of his sentence. On August 6, 1936, his suspension would end, but before that time, the authorities would have to make their judgment if he had to go back to parchment or remain free. It was almost a godsend that the WPA gave him a job in early May. The little family was under tremendous pressure. On August 5, 1939, Governor White authorised 90 days of freedom for Vernon for good behaviour while out of former suspension. The new date was November 3. Vernon had passed the 6-month test, and now he faced another countdown. 2 years after he was first arrested, on that very day that Vernon's 3-month reprieve ended, he received an indefinite suspension of his sentence. Vernon continued working with the Lee County Sanitation Project well into 1941. For a part in 1941, he worked for Leake and Godlet Lumberyard. Then he took a job with the S&W Construction Company in Sardis, Mississippi, 70 miles west of Tupelo. In September of 1941, Elvis started school in the first grade at Ledyard Primary School on South Broadway Street, just across from Maple Street, 1.5 blocks from where he lived with his parents. The Tupelo Garment Factory was located at 495 South Green Street, and it was an easy walk for Elvis to school and Gladys to walk to work. The part of South Tupelo was called Milltown, as it still is today. Now, you can see on the map, you can see the Presley home. You can see the school just across the road, and up the top there you can see the garment factory where Gladys worked. So it was all in very easy walking distance for them. In 1942, America was at war, and Vernon seemed eager to leave Lee County and take advantage of well-paying job opportunities abundantly elsewhere. In 1942, Vernon held 5 jobs. Despite the inconsistency of his labour, he was making money at a rate that must have amazed and delighted him. But that means also that most of the time he was far away from home. From age 3 until 7 was a very sad time for Elvis. For much of that time, he had only his mother to hold on to. For most of his childhood, women raised him, with very little influence from his father. Vernon had worked out of town for over a year, coming back to Tupelo only on weekends. Gladys and Elvis stayed at home alone. On one occasion, Vernon was very much needed, but he wasn't there. In 1942, Gladys was brought into the hospital on a stretcher. She was in great pain. Elvis was holding her hand and crying. Gladys, it turned out, was having a miscarriage. Not only had she lost a second baby, she was also distressed about the cost. She had only $10 to live on until Vernon returned, and she couldn't pay the hospital bill. Nurse Leona Moore told her not to worry. The county paid in such situations as hers. Still distressed, Gladys asked what was she going to do with Elvis. The nurse told her not to worry. She would send for Vernon's uncle Noah to come and get Elvis. In September 1942, just before Elvis was to start his second grade, Vernon and his cousin Sales decided that Ingalls Shipyard in Pascagoula, Mississippi, was the place to work. And that's the shipyard. Sales and his wife Annie, their 2 kids, Vernon, Gladys with Elvis, packed their meager belongings and loaded their household goods into 2 old rusty black 1936 Fords and left Tupelo at sunrise. Arriving at their destination late that evening, they saw the ocean for the very first time. The work was hard but exceedingly well paid. Vernon got $1.20 an hour for a 45-hour week and $1.80 an hour for overtime. Workers and families lived in slept-together quarters. During the days, the children were separated because it was September and Elvis enrolled in school in Pascagoula. The South Mississippi school was quite different from East Tupelo school. None of his friends and relatives were in his class. The child didn't know his way around the new school. He had to ride the big yellow bus, and that frightened him. Every morning Elvis cried to be home with his cousins. The kids here didn't talk like him. Lots of the children were bronzed from long hours in the hot sun and the sea, but Elvis's pale skin was dead white in comparison. Reading classes made him feel uncomfortable because he felt like the other kids laughed at his pronunciation. Arithmetic was some better. Elvis knew his number facts and could finish timed drills faster than most of the other children. The day he had music classes were his best of all. The winter season approached, and it was getting cooler. Many cold days and very cold winds. The duplex was not insulated, and the family often layered their beds with the quilts that they brought from home. Hard manual labour of the fathers and the long days with plenty of overtime kept their life simple. The families worked, ate, slept, and went to school. The mums cared for their young, prepared meals for their families, and did routine household tasks. But there was plenty of time for visiting and hobbies. New foods were introduced to the families. Neither lady enjoyed the oysters or the shrimp, but the men did. Elvis was reluctant to try anything new unless his mother tried it first. Traditional foods like green beans and potatoes, or turnip greens and cornbread that the families had known in the hill country was not available on the coast. Homesickness swept in between Thanksgiving and Christmas. Many days found Gladys weepy. She returned again and again to her fear about Elvis sleepwalking. She had to sleep with her child for fear he would get up and open the door and perhaps get out onto the highway, or worse, get to the ocean. One could see when Gladys had been awake through the late hours of the night because she had black circles around her eyes, and her disposition would be sullen and fretful. Vernon was often the victim of her vicious tongue. At school, Elvis continued to feel alone. but he was a good C student. Gladys was so pleased when her young son brought home his grades. His deportment was always given an S for satisfactory. Elvis learned well his lessons regarding yes ma'am or no ma'am. His please and thank yous made his teachers realise that this child had been trained at home. When he got his report card with the words passed the 3rd grade, he ran to his mum for hugs. Things went smoothly for the two families until about mid-July. The two women were sitting at the front porch, watching their children playing in the wet sand. Suddenly Sales raced in to the car park, jumped out of his car, and yelled at his wife, "Annie, get your stuff together, we're going home." Annie got the children ready for bed while her husband continued to rant and rave. She could hear Gladys sobbing on the other side of the duplex. Elvis could be heard patting his mama and saying, "Mama, it's going to be all right. Daddy and me will take care of you." On July 20, Sales and his family left Pascagoula to go back to Tupelo. Annie was pregnant, and she wanted to come home to Tupelo for the birth of her child Sybil, who was born in December of 1943. But Gladys and Vernon decided to stay. Although within hours, Vernon and Gladys threw their things into their car and headed north as well. When Sales and his family stopped for lunch at a roadside cafe on their journey homewards, another car full of smiling faces pulled up to the gas pumps. Elvis hung out the window, slapping the side of the car, yelling, "We're here! We're going home too!" Even Gladys, with deeply shadowed eyes, smiled. She was happy, but literally exhausted. Gladys told them, "We are not staying down here alone, watching all those uptown folks eating their shrimp and oysters." After filling the gas tanks and sharing the food, Sales urged, "Let's all go home." Happily reunited, both couples drove back to Tupelo. It was during this time that Vernon's father, Jesse, sold Vernon's little house on the old Saltillo Road out from under him. The question is, why was it possible for JD to sell Vernon's house? It didn't belong to him. Maybe he had been paying the rent while Vernon was in jail. Maybe that gave him the right. Maybe he needed the money. The reason of why was never known. When they returned to Tupelo, Jesse had left Tupelo to work at the shipyard. Vernon and his family moved in with his mum, Minnie Mae, in his parents' house on Old Suthill Road until she lost the house because Jesse didn't send her any money. Elvis and his mother were back home in East Tupelo. Vernon moved his family into a duplex at 904 Kelly Street. The family were in the arms of friends. They didn't care. Friends and real neighbours. The 3rd grade in East Tupelo Elementary School, now named Lahon School, was a place of joy for Elvis. Elvis discovered a new world for himself. He had found his escape. Not only was to become his art, his music, but also into what was to become an important part of his fantasy life, his reading. The shy boy had set about to learn to read, motivated by his desire to follow more closely the thrilling adventures of the heroes he had discovered in comic books. Elvis was able to exist for hours, independently and happily, in a world without his mother. flying high with the Marvels, the Batmans, and the Supermans. On the playground, games were another source of joy to Elvis and his neighbourhood friends. At this time, the children tended to divide into gender-based playgroups. However, even in East Tupelo, there were divisions based on social and economic status. In the 3rd grade, this became an issue when several boys in the class decided to create a conflict with Elvis. They called him names like Sissy and Mama's Boy, and when Gladys regularly appeared in the classroom to escort her son and his cousins home, this added fuel to the fire. While many of these children had fathers in the home, Elvis's dad was an infrequent parent. Elvis's mother did not stay at home and wait for her son to come in from school, nor did she greet him with cookies and a glass of milk. No, she came to the school to walk him and his cousins across the busy Highway 78 to bring them safe down into their own Kelly Street neighbourhood. Elvis wore different clothing from the fellows in his class. His handmade khakis were loose on his skinny body. The white flower sack shirts he wore, not like the flannels and ginghams that other students wore. And finally, Elvis was ultra polite, even to those who were aggressive towards him. Gladys insisted that he not get involved in fights or confrontations. She instilled the turn the other cheek attitude. During these days, Elvis practiced a coping mechanism he would use for the rest of his life. He learned to withdraw. There were challenges in the classroom. Elvis would find simple, easy, out-of-the-way spots from the place of conflict and quietly move his own self out of the situation. He wouldn't cry or complain. He just endured, and this behaviour can be seen throughout his life. On the one hand, he was to be a famous entertainer who could play and be boisterous, but on the other, he'd go into a quiet room and withdraw. In 1943, age 8, he sung on the local radio, accompanied by guitar, by a man who had become his living idol, country and western singer Mississippi Slim. His real name was Carvel Lee Osborne. After the show, Slim declared that Elvis had done pretty well considering his age, but complained that the kid can't keep time. On August 18, 1945, Vernon put down $200 in cash towards buying a brand new solid 4-room house on Berry Street at the foot of the hill, just below the little house where Elvis was born. The purchase price was $2,000 and the repayments were $30 a month plus 6% interest. The seller was Orville Bean. Yep, the same man that had sent Vernon to prison and then did more than any other man to get him out again. Now, obviously both men had forgiven each other because now Bean had supplied the Presleys with their second house. September 1945, when he was 10 years old, Elvis's gift as a singer led his elementary school to enter him into the talent contest held yearly in Tupelo as part of the annual Mississippi-Alabama Mid-South State Fair and Dairy Show. His talent had been discovered by his 5th grade teacher, Mrs. J.C. Oleta Grimes, the daughter of Orville Bean. She persuaded the principal of East Tupelo Consolidated School to enter him in the contest as a candidate, sponsored by the school. In the show, Elvis stood on a box behind the microphone and sang Old Shep, one of his favourites. Winners were identified by popular applause from an audience of about 2,000 people. Elvis won 5th place. He had found his prestige piece, his singing voice. It was a happy summer for Elvis, visiting family, playing with his cousins. At least, he was back home again. And you can see Elvis there on the end, right on the right hand side with glasses, and that is the picture of all the winners, the place getters in the contest. Elvis came fifth. And that's Elvis on the back of the bull. That's him there on the left, his cousin in the front, and that's a picture of his cousins, and there he is in the front looking very serious, like he really doesn't want to be there. But yeah, very cute photo. Sales was able to find a job quickly, and before long he and Annie had gotten back on their feet. But it was not the case with Vernon. Even though able-bodied men were scarce and generally in demand in the little town of East Tupelo, few people were willing to take a risk on Vernon. Not only was he a reluctant worker, but he had an unsavoury record that was well known to most employers in Tupelo. After a couple of months, he was able to get a day job doing what he enjoyed most, driving a truck. Vernon went to work for L.P. McCarthy and Son, a wholesale grocery business in Tupelo. Vernon stuck with that job, with 1 or 2 interruptions, for the next 5 years. The problem was that the job did not pay well. The income was less than half of what he had gotten used to in the shipyard. At the shipyard, he had earned $70 a week. In working for McCarthy, he was paid $21 a week. Once again, the family seemed to be on the road to poverty. The family was behind in their bills. Home life was strangely lonely. Gladys wanted to be in East Tupelo, but she didn't spend much time coddling her husband. He found too many opportunities to go to the different entertainment venues in the neighbourhood. While he was unemployed, with much of his time was spent up in the Goose Hollow among the nightclubs and gambling joints. No one can say exactly the details of his lifestyle, but the neighbours and family members can recall the gossip and innuendo around at the time. Apparently, during this time, Vernon began a life of drinking and gambling. Still a young man, and very handsome to boot, Vernon frequented the various establishments around the town. He was actively womanizing, and this added to Gladys's feelings of inadequacy. Her diet, like that of many other women in the neighbourhood, was heavily laden with simple carbohydrates and fat. Both lard and butter were readily available, and she used them a lot. Beans, bread, sweet and dairy products were her daily fare. Her weight ballooned during these years. Little Elvis was not plump like his mum. His skinny little arms and legs, evident in the family photos, actually the 8-year-old would have been in the lower percentage for his weight and height. During these years, Elvis would sleep with his mother in a bed that never knew if or when Vernon was coming home. Like his father, Jesse before him, Vernon took many trips away from home, always seeking a more lucrative job and one with greater dignity. Gladys always used Elvis sleepwalking as an excuse for sleeping with her. 1946, the year that changed Elvis's little world yet again. He got his first guitar. Elvis was 10 years old now, and on a Saturday he went with Noah Presley and his family to town for shopping. Noah had parked the bus in the vacant area between the railroad crossing and the Tupelo Hardware. Elvis jumped off the bus, turned and headed towards the Tupelo Hardware store. "Not yet," Gladys said. "I need to do a little shopping first." Now, there are varying stories about Elvis and his first guitar, but I'm led to believe that this version is the truth. Elvis actually had the money himself to purchase the guitar. It was his own money that he wanted to spend on a rifle. He got the money from a man who accidentally broke his new wooden wagon. That was a Christmas gift. The next Saturday was the day to go to Tupelo to replace the broken toy. When all the shopping was done, Gladys was ready to go in the shop. She walked in with Elvis, and on the left-hand side were the nicest 22 rifles that she'd ever seen. And of course, Elvis rushed straight towards that display. But his mother's arm guided him to another direction. His eyes turned to see what his mother was looking at. About 8 feet up the wall was a display of guitars. The salesman noted the attention and asked, "Do you play the guitar, ma'am?" "No, my little man here does." Elvis made only a glance or two back to the rifles before his full attention was on the glistening instrument. The smart salesman immediately climbed the sliding ladder to take down the smallest of the instruments. He slid the strap over Elvis's head, adjusted the perfect angle to Elvis's small body. He handed him a small ivory pick, and Elvis immediately placed his slender little fingers on the frets, just as his Uncle Frank had taught him when Gladys moved in with her cousin Frank and his wife when Vernon was in prison. When he strummed the strings with the pick, there was just enough harmony for the salesman to brag generously on the child's talent. Elvis placed his money on the counter. The salesman counted the money and returned 2 $1 bills to Elvis. The employee, F.L. Bobo, recalls the papers and said it was $12. But you could really get a good guitar back in those days for $12. But this one was only $7.75. Of course, we had a 2% sales tax. "Now, son," he said, "if you practice hard, you might be famous one day." Elvis strolled out of the store with the guitar still hanging around his body. When they got back to Uncle Noah's bus, he grinned and told him, "Got me a new guitar." He chorded and strummed all the way home. When he got off the bus in East Tupelo, a new passion had taken over Elvis's life. And there we have it. There's an actual picture of that first guitar. In 1946, Vernon's family fell very close to the bottom again. In July, they lost their new house. Vernon and Gladys had not done the basic math on the monthly mortgage and fell behind in their payments. The math was not difficult. Vernon had committed himself to pay $30 a month on the loan when about $24 would have been much more manageable. His weekly pay was only $22, which came to a rough $95 a month. After taxes and other expenses, the Presleys would have mighty little to live on. Orville Bean took possession of the house again, and he sold it to Aaron Kennedy, Vernon's best friend, for $3,000. Elvis was 11 years old when his family moved out of its sturdy new 4-room house and settled in a shack on the edge of the city dump in Tupelo proper. The rundown wooden structure they now occupied was on Mulberry Alley. And if you see down the bottom of that picture there, you can see a white arrow pointing to the house. That is the house that they occupied. The neighbourhood called it Milltown, right next to the fairgrounds and across from the coloured quarter called Shake Rag. Moving to Tupelo proper meant, however, that Elvis would no longer be able to attend his old school, Instead, he had to walk from Mulberry Alley barefoot and in overalls to begin the 6th grade at his new school, Milham Junior High. The school change was Elvis's biggest cultural shock. The majority of his schoolmates would make him feel it. But there was also a very rigid and entirely new social system to adjust to. When Elvis started the 6th grade at Milham in September 1946, his exceedingly low status in the social hierarchy became painfully apparent. Milham School included all the children of the wealthiest, best educated and most prestigious families in town, as well as the poorest. Everyone in the school, teachers, students and principal, was exceedingly conscious of precisely where in the social pyramid he or she and everyone else stood. It all depended on who your people were. Elvis was at the bottom, if not somewhere below the bottom. Because his father, Vernon Presley, ex-convict who drove a delivery truck and lived in a rundown shack in Shake Rag near the city dump among the blacks. The Milham kids teased Elvis because he was a hick, because he didn't have the right clothes and precious few of the wrong ones, and because he liked to sing and he was good. But they used to laugh at Elvis because his house had no front porch. Things were not nearly as good as his former school. Elvis felt like an outsider in this strange situation. His fear and lack of personal support system caused him to be unable to read aloud with fluency. He muttered and stammered when he was asked to stand before the class for any assignment. A light stutter remained for the rest of his life when he was nervous. The students posed with their teacher on several steps leading up to the school. Elvis, relatively slender and small, is the only one of 24 students wearing overalls. And there he is, right up the back, right on the right hand side, just below the red arrow. His feet were hidden, but he's the only one without shoes. In East Tupelo, a schoolboy of 11 years in overalls and barefooted in warm weather would have been totally unremarkable. He's also the only child in the photo not clearly smiling or making a very pleasing face. Vernon and several of his Presley kin were looking for work. Other family members were relocating, some as far away as they could, to find a job. Vernon just had to get out of Tupelo and make a decent life for himself and his family. There wasn't much to do in East Tupelo, except go to church or go to the honky-tonks in Goose Hollow and dance with the women of the night who were housed there. Gladys shamed him every time he went out and spent money on himself when she needed it for the house or for Elvis. Vernon decided that morning that he was moving to Memphis, the centre of employment. That is where employment opportunities were best. He began a campaign to talk to Gladys into leaving their neighbourhood and close friends. As Vernon saw it, the first step might be moving just a mile or two away from Berry Street. He managed to get another little truck, driving for L.P. McCarthy and using that salary. With that salary, he went up on North Green Street and found a small house. Gladys was furious about the location and indicated that if he could not find a better house, she was moving in with some of her folks back in East Tupelo. She screamed at her husband when he came in to announce the move. There ain't no church up there, not like ours anyway. That's the worst section of town. I ain't never had to live like this before. Elvis had joined his mother in her outburst and stood between the two of them. Vernon had stomped out of the house, grabbing his car keys, and spent all his money buying booze, and could not walk well enough to get home. Several hours later, his brother Vesta found him. Vesta, always the most dependable, had come to take his younger brother home to try and talk some sense into his hard head. The next morning, there was a cold reception in the kitchen when Vernon, bleary-eyed and smelling like old beer, woke up for breakfast. But there was no food on the table. The coffee was cold and tasted bitter. Gladys and Elvis were gone. Vernon hoped they'd gone to church. It was Sunday morning, and Vernon was afraid that they might not come home. In the meantime, Gladys and Elvis were at church, as he hoped. She talked with her pastor, asking for advice, but all he told her was that as Vernon's wife, she had the duty to follow him because the husband is the head of the house, and if she didn't do so, she'd be sinning. Gladys didn't think that she could go against what the pastor directed. But when she got home, she began packing her clothes, and the future looked bleak. Elvis looked confused. What did this move mean? The family moved into the two-room shack in North Tupelo for the first time since Elvis was born. Gladys began to seek public work. Since she was a skilled seamstress, she went to work doing alterations at Long's Laundry. She was depressed and spent most of the time crying and worrying about her downfall. Finally, Vernon located another place up on 1010 North Green Street, Tupelo, and rented a little 3-bedroom house. On Green Street, Elvis was afraid to go into the house after dark because his mama wasn't home most days. She worked and then had to walk about 10 blocks one way to get home. Vernon was totally unpredictable. He said he was working, but Elvis wasn't sure about that. Some days he would be home when Elvis came home from school. Other days his son didn't see him at all. Elvis had his first fight in Milam School when the child of the owner of a garment factory offered to bring him some real shirts. The young man wanted to share with the poor kid, but the pride of the poor kid took major offense at the suggestions, and he had to have charity meant that he did not want to accept that charity. He took it as an insult, when the other child was just trying to relay a good intention. Well, you can see what happened there. You can see Elvis's mouth. He copped a good one. Not long after they moved into North Green Street, Vernon's mother, Minnie May, moved in with them. Her husband, Jesse, had simply taken off in 1946 and never came back. In 1947, he sued Minnie May for divorce. In his bold and outrageous way, he claimed that she had deserted him. She refused to join him. Minnie May told the court that Jesse had deserted her, but the court gave Jesse D his divorce and did not require him to pay alimony. Gladys and Elvis stayed with their relatives from Friday until Sunday in East Tupelo because they feared the neighbourhood. On Friday and Saturday nights, when altercations happened in some joints in the rough areas of North Green Street, Gladys just wanted to go back to East Tupelo and demanded that Vernon move back in their old neighbourhood. Early in May, just after school was out, Vernon made the decision he wasn't going to have peace until he agreed. He told Gladys that she could stay there and he was going to find a better job. He agreed to stay in East Tupelo if he couldn't find a better job in Memphis. In his sly way, he had established a pattern that would bring his wife utter misery and permanently remove both Elvis and his mother from their basic support groups. In 1947, the Presleys became relatively prosperous again, as their income tax return for that year shows. Vernon apparently worked about half the year for McCarthy, earning $887, and the other half for another grocery company, DW Food Products, earning $756. Gladys worked as a seamstress at Reed Brothers, a department store, earning $269. Together, Vernon and Gladys earned $1,913, almost $160 a month. Now, the Presleys were definitely no longer poor, and their consumption rate went up. By February 1947, they had acquired a 1936 Chevrolet. They paid for its repair, and again for its repair in April. In November, they bought a linoleum rug, a heater, a new mattress and springs, and an amazingly large number of pillows, 8 pairs. They paid $17.30 down on the price of these items. They made the monthly payments until September 24, 1951, when the payments ceased. In January 1948, the Presleys bought a Philco radio phonograph and paid $9 for 60 quarts of buttermilk, apparently delivered to the doorstep by the Carmire's Dairy. In February, they bought an oil stove. Elvis, too, benefited from this new prosperity. He got his long-awaited and brand new bicycle. On the afternoon before Valentine's Day, Friday, February 13, 1948, Gladys gave Elvis a valentine of great significance for them both. Dressed in their best clothes, they walked into Lee County Library on Madison Street, where Elvis made out an application for a library card. This would have been an unusual step for any 13-year-old in Tupelo to have taken, let alone a Presley. It would have been a momentary attack of embarrassment for Gladys, as she painfully affixed her signature under Elvis's on the application card to make it valid. As for Elvis, whatever stab of dismay he might have experienced looking at her poor, blotted, badly formed letters, he would have been quickly healed by the rush of tenderness and pride he felt for her, as he smiled at her and she bravely smiled back. Gladys always was very proud that Elvis had the possibility to go to school and learn, getting an education, something she nor Vernon had never had. Both of them had left school, Gladys maybe 3rd grade and Vernon 6th grade. No wonder they wanted a better life for their son. Then Vernon found an empty duplex on Kelly Street, and the family moved back across the levee into a house just a few doors down from his cousin Sales and his wife Annie, Gladys's best friend. 1-2-4-1 Kelly Street. But it seems that Vernon had slipped back into his old winding path. Working at McCarthy's, Vernon got the permission to use his delivery truck for private rides, and bringing his family to visit other family members and friends in East Tupelo, but this wasn't the only purpose he used the truck for. He had been dealing with liquor out of his delivery truck, and also there was an impression that vagrant animals, livestock with cash value like pigs, had disappeared in the wake of Vernon's passing vehicle as it moved through the countryside. Suspicious-minded police officers didn't like him his looks, his manner, deacon of the East Tupelo Assembly of God Church or not. Once again, Vernon was unemployed because McCarthy fired him for reasons that aren't clear, but can be assumed. That possibility supported by the fact that Vernon began to borrow significant sums of money in April and in May of 1948. Vernon took out a $12 loan from Tower Loan Brokers to be paid back in 20 monthly instalments of $56 each. In May, he borrowed $63 to be paid back in 12 monthly instalments of $5.30 each. In August, he borrowed $200 to be paid back in 20 weekly instalments of $10 each. On October 19, he again borrowed $200 to be paid back in 20 weekly instalments of $10 each. On Saturday night, November 6, he, Gladys and Elvis left for Memphis, with the last loan supplied would have been to pay the funds for the Presleys to relocate. It's easy to imagine 13-year-old Elvis watching the landscape change from rural to urban the closer they got to their destination. Cotton fields gave way to industrial smokestacks, spewing bad-smelling fumes, and the road became crowded with cars. Elvis would have felt his heart sink as the crowded city came into view. The life he had known was over forever. Well, there you go, guys. The family were on the move again. They had so many moves, didn't they? That was just in Tupelo. Now they're on the way to Memphis. Next video, we'll discuss their move to Memphis, where they lived in Memphis. How many times do you think they moved? We'll find out. Thanks, guys, for watching. Don't forget to like, press subscribe, and comment down the bottom. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.